President of Technical Strategy at IBM, it was felt that there was a pressing need to understand this technical and socio-technical system. And since then, we've variously been engaged in trying to promote this so it becomes, in a sense, respectable. Because we all here, as Helen pointed out, working at disciplinary boundaries is fine and dandy, but actually sometimes it can be difficult within an academic career structure. There aren't the journals in existence. Some people will be at the core of their discipline and a little bit suspicious of those at the periphery. So we spent time, and in fact, I think that was time well spent, whether it was the communications of the ACM article that Jim led on, and that really, I think, had an impact on our computer science colleagues to say, yeah, there's really interesting, important questions here. Tim and I wrote a more popular exposition that appeared in the Scientific American, where we were trying to lay out why this should matter to people. Now, people argue about whether this is an old or a new discipline. Actually, it's a set of complementary disciplines. It's a set of disciplines which are trying to understand the web, which seems to be a system based on a set of simple principles that gives rise to complexity. Now, that's interesting because in many areas of natural science, those simple principles let loose at scale give rise to striking emergent phenomena. That happens in physics, it happens in biology, maybe it happens in these engineered information fabrics. So our observation was perhaps we needed a systems-oriented view of the web. Perhaps we needed to think about it as an ecosystem. And also the observation that this wasn't really an approach that was being taken routinely, certainly within our own schools and departments. And a process that tries to account for both the design and engineering aspect of our disciplines and the analytical side. Now, again, I'll talk about this a bit more because there's always been an interesting, we talk about tribes. It isn't as if there's a tribal difference between social scientists and computer scientists. There are some quite deep tribal differences between those who would characterize themselves as engineers and those who would characterize themselves as scientists. Now, I'll talk about that a little too. And it's an approach that we want to be rooted firmly on the social as well as the technical. Now, this diagram has famously been, well, it's been described many things, many of which I couldn't possibly repeat here in polite company. But what it was an attempt to point out that the discipline will need to bring, web science will need to bring key methods and insights from other areas. It can't reside on its own at the top here, computer science, web engineering, some maths and AI, without an understanding of the economic incentivization, how economics works on the web, or the legal restrictions, or the socio-cultural drivers. You wouldn't understand the web as it currently exists. And these little kind of subfields, you can look at them and speculate whether they're complete, necessary, or sufficient. But actually, each of them was an area where we thought there was some plausible argument to say at some point it would be appropriate for a researcher trying to understand the web to perhaps think about the web as an ecosystem. So for example, here in ecology, we have some very interesting work by people in that field who try to think of a complex ecosystem, the natural world, in terms of networks, in terms of producers and consumers, in terms of food chains. Do these things actually apply in an interesting, meaningful way when we think about the web? In the same way that when we look at the work in various areas of economics, do they work in a similar way? Now, web science wasn't not being done before we arrived. Of course, lots of people were thinking about the system. The issue was more that it wasn't a coherent or perhaps integrated effort. And some of the early work that many of you will be familiar with, many of you are researching on, is this whole issue of the web structure. And we know a lot about the web structure now. Although it had to be discovered, it was a surprise to learn that the web had this scale-free structure, that it obeyed power laws, that in fact there was no average number of links that any web page had, that some were massively linked to and others much more less so. And in fact, this long tail distribution is interesting because, again, models like that, you can get persuaded that is the truth everywhere on the web, and there's suggestions that it's in some places not always like this. But what is the actual structure? Occupy people and researchers over the last decade or so, and of course understanding the structure of the web turns out to be important, because if you realize that not every web page or site is more or less equivalently important, if you take a random page or site down in a web that has this connectivity, it will continue to be linked in quite a coherent fashion. If you take the top 15% of most linked sites out, you will cause considerable damage to the integrity of the overall system. So the issue about resilience and safety in the web shape turned out to be an important and enduring insight. And understanding what more you can do with that you can trace the important parts of the web, turns out to be important too. Okay, let me just... So web science has been done before. We're trying to bring these elements together. Jim Hendler has a very nice way of describing our ambition as well. It isn't that we're trying to turn everybody into an expert in these various collaborating disciplines. And neither is it everything. Some people say, well, what isn't web science? It seems to be just about everything. It's not the union of these disciplines, Jim said, but more than their intersection. So how do you understand this additionality principle, that if you bring bits of these disciplines together, you get better insight? And that's one of the things that's perplexing us, and we're trying to seek to understand. But I would say, coming back to this whole issue about the web's shape or structure, interestingly, authors from ecology, so a very famous scientist in the UK, Bob May, has written extensively on networks in nature, has become interested in the Web Science Project, and observes that actually a lot of the mathematical analysis of the web structure could do well to look at how networks work in biology, because actually weak links are really important in real ecosystems. And the importance of weak links is something that he reminds us of. There's a very nice paper that Bob wrote on this topic in 2006. And it's a good example of where, by looking into an allied discipline, we can gain insight and understanding. And in fact, that kind of interest, and this is not in an invidious sense to choose one paper or poster over another, but I was drawn to a poster here at the conference, which is, again, looking at the nature of the structure of the web, the dynamic web graph. This is work by Bodino and Donato, people who are looking to harvest the web at large scale. They've harvested the UK domain, and looking at how quickly web pages and websites come in and out of that